Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together leading UK columnists with foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast from the Dateline London. Britain's Conservatives like to think of themselves as belonging to the natural party of government. This week it's looked more like the natural party of farce. Two cabinet ministers announced publicly they'd had enough of Boris Johnson. Mr Johnson had not had enough of himself, and for 48 hours he dug in his heels, refusing to resign as Prime Minister, even as one after another members of his government resigned. In all, 5 cabinet level and 23 junior ministers quit because he wouldn't, along with a couple of dozen parliamentary aides. On Wednesday evening, the Prime Minister sacked one of his oldest allies who told him to go. Another who'd accepted promotion from him just the night before, then deserted his cause too. Mr Johnson insisted the voters had given him a mandate to govern, and he would do just that. Some feared he was considering a fresh appeal to the nation by calling a general election. A Prime Minister who dissolved Parliament once when he couldn't get his way might do so again. In fact, come Thursday lunchtime, Boris Johnson had decided he had to go. He announced his resignation, but he blamed not himself, but what he called the herd instinct of his party. When time is up for Tory leaders, they are visited by the men in grey suits, political grandees. Well, the verdict in the Dateline studio is delivered by the men and women with grey hairs. In other words, with decades of experience between them of writing and broadcasting about the UK. Janet Daly's weekly column appears in the Sunday Telegraph, a source of succour to British Conservatives. Though he hails from the country which hosts the European Union, the Belgian economist Marc Roche, who writes for Le Point in France, shared Boris Johnson's enthusiasm for Brexit. And Thomas Kielinger has been explaining the British to his fellow Germans for a quarter of a century, although he first lived in this country back in 1960. A warm welcome to all of you. You have seen so many British Prime Ministers come in a blaze of optimism and glory, or force majeure because they've succeeded somebody else who's gone, and then you've seen them end. Sadly, as I think it was, Powell suggested, always in tears and always at the end of a career in failure. Janet Daly, was this one written in the stars from long ago? Was it genuinely a surprise in the end how?
It wasn't a surprise to anybody except Boris Johnson, apparently. And it was remarkable for one thing, in that it wasn't to do with policy, it was to do with personality. And the removal of him was being demanded not because he'd made some horrendous mistake in the way he'd handled government or dealt with legislation, but because he was considered to be dishonourable. And that puts this in a very different category. And the tragedy is, I suppose, if you could call it a kind of comic tragedy, is that even at the end, as you said, he referred to this herd mentality that had pushed him out. Obviously, he felt unjustly. Even at the end, he didn't have enough self-knowledge to understand that it was his character. In fact, when he was abroad and he was interviewed about this, he said, if you're expecting me to reconstruct my personality or my character, that's not going to happen. And that's absolutely right. It's not going to happen. And he was caught out in a series of what have to be assumed to be deliberate lies and obfuscations. He refused, even to the end, after 3 or 4 interviewers asked him whether he had made this extraordinary remark about this predatory man who was making sexual advances
to other men.
To other men. He had obviously...
And this was a man who was in the government and he'd been Deputy Chief Whip, so he was sort of in charge of discipline.
He was Deputy Chief Whip at that time. He was... Boris made a joke, which was an absolutely characteristic Boris joke. With those of us, I've known him for 20 years, this is an absolutely characteristic Boris Johnson joke, when he said, he's Pincher by name, because that is his name, and Pincher by nature. He was asked in 3 separate interviews that I saw whether it was true that he'd said that, and he evaded the question all those times. Now that is not acceptable. It was his integrity and his character that were in question, not his governing policies. And he obviously thought that was deeply unjust. He obviously thought he got the policy right on COVID, on vaccination program, on the war. So why wasn't that enough? And he did not see that it was simply unacceptable to have a man who can tell lies of that kind or evade the truth in that way as Prime Minister.
And yet, Marc Roche, there still seemed to be a significant number, although they were clearly now a minority in the Parliamentary Conservative Party, who still wanted him to stay as Prime Minister, still in a sense thought that the voters had kind of priced in that element of his character, but would still be willing to see him continue because of what they saw as kind of qualities outweighing his flaws.
Well, despite we knew he was a serial liar, the partners in Europe have suffered that when he was saying one thing one day and then in private and then another thing in public. So we knew that. But they thought, I suppose, that because he had such a extraordinary victory in the polls and he had managed to take all these Labour constituency for the first time, that he will do that again, that he had a magic touch with the public. But I'm very happy he went, because on the whole, it's a marvelous lesson of democracy. You cannot lie. In other countries on the continent, very often politicians lie and politicians stay and continue. Here, he didn't. He had to go. So I think it shows that the British political system is still based on this rigoristic, slightly Protestant, slightly where your private life and your public life has to stick together, which is a good thing.
And yet, Thomas, his party tolerated this behaviour or misbehaviour on more than one occasion. And some might say it's not a great reflection on the Conservative Party or the Conservative Parliamentary Party that it was willing, many of them, going into TV studios, parroting a line that they'd given them, and clearly on more than one occasion not really believing it themselves, or certainly not being very convincing in delivering it. I mean, is there a danger for the Conservatives that they may think, look, we've cauterised the wound, he's gone, or he will have gone after the election of a successor, but that the voters might not be quite as tolerant of that and quite as willing to forgive past sins?
Well, the Conservatives fell victim to the mantra, there's no alternative to Boris Johnson. He is the natural winner. He will get us through every problem, every thick and thin, so let him forgive some of these delinquencies, as it were. But, you know, it was wrong right from the start, because one issue that helped him come out big was Brexit. And Dominic Cummings said the other day,
his former advisor,
former chief advisor, why he got him into the Downing Street was because we had a problem with one issue at the time, not because we thought he was going to be such a political great beast. I mean, that is a rather, how shall I say, tragic explanation how this party is sort of one-trick pony party at the beginning, Brexit overall, forgetting, by the way, that one of the reasons he won so big had to do with Corbyn, the opponent, who was pretty unelectable, so it was to be a massive victory. But it was just for one issue. He was untested, and the forbearance that they showed him was beginning to wane more and more until it completely
Does that worry you, Janet, that he may damage his party even if he is no longer its leader?
He was never properly a team player. He was never really the sort of person who normally gets elected as party leader. I mean, I wouldn't take what Dominic Cummings says absolutely to heart. I mean, Dominic Cummings now loathes him and is out to get him. So I is delighted at his fall. So I wouldn't take that too seriously. I mean, you have to remember too that Boris was a fantastically popular and successful mayor of London in a city which is normally solidly Labour, and that was perfect as a job for him because it was a fun job, and the mayor of London doesn't really have all that much power, and he can't pass much legislation. So that was fine, and that kind of popularity, that sort of slightly buffoonish sort of quality that was endearing in a mayor, was not so great in a prime minister, even with the best of, without all the serious sort of lying and misleading. That was not going to work.
He was an actor on the stage, of course, and people. This is a theatre nation. They like theatrical performances.
And we've had theatrical prime ministers before who've still managed to do a good job.
Absolutely. Yes. Also, they like eccentricity. Far much longer will they tolerate it than anyone, say, in Germany would, with such a colourful character like Johnson. And that's why I thought it was particularly funny that he he complained about his eccentric party colleagues who stopped him in his tracks in the middle of a successful management.
But the sad thing about him is that as mayor of London, he was cosmopolitan, he was open to the outside world, it became the seventh city in the world, and then he becomes prime minister, and he represents a sort of nationalistic view of England, little England, and he you know, in Europe they thought that's not the Boris we like.
I think there's a misunderstanding there. I mean, I am very cosmopolitan. I come from an immigrant family. My father didn't speak English until he went to school, and I have no problem at all with cosmopolitan cities and ethnic diversity, but I was for Brexit, and I was for Brexit because I think that you should elect the people who make your laws.
Now,
that was Boris's argument too.
But you know, the result of Brexit was about immigration.
But let's talk about before we legislate Brexit, refight that battle. The interesting thing about is the European reaction to this in particular, and then we can talk a bit more the wider world. But in Paris, the Élysée Palace made not much secret of the fact that it's glad he was gone. Notwithstanding, I was at the G7 a couple of weeks ago and we had those big bonhomie, arm around the shoulders stuff between Macron and Boris and cuddling up to each other and all the rest of it in support of Ukraine and against Putin. But in the end, there was very poor relationships between him and some European leaders.
It was the worst president.
Why does that matter for the future of the UK?
It's essential that the UK has a good partnership, not an antagonist partnership, with the EU, and especially with France on defense and security, because those are the two main armies on the continent. They have atomic bomb and they have a permanent seat on the Security Council. So it's essential. And Boris was antagonistic to a point where there was a crisis in the Entente Cordiale, not seen since de Gaulle in the 60s, when he refused, quite rightly, I think, to have the British in the European Union. So the French couldn't wait to get rid of that. This being said, on the long term, they don't expect too much from the successor, because the problem we have, because of Brexit, are above one person.
Is there a worry for you, Janet, that you've been consistent and passionately supportive of Brexit, and you make the point that you did it on the very straightforward grounds of sovereignty, very clear argument. Lots of people who voted for all kinds of things, and you could argue that people voted for it for whatever they were particularly annoyed about, and that was the skill of the campaign, in a sense, that it could bring in all these different concerns and grumpiness and, you know, disaffection with politics could all be channeled into Brexit. Are you worried, though, that what gave him that success might undermine the achievements of Brexit? In other words, that his great success was to convince people of things that turn out not to be true, like if we stay in the European Union, Turkey will join and then we won't be able to stop immigrants coming in. There's all this money that we painted on the side of a bus that's going to go to the NHS as soon as we leave the EU, etc. Yeah. And that actually the stuff that really was genuine and has been achieved by Brexit will be undermined by this sense of, you know, we were misled.
That's a quite complicated argument.
It's a complicated way of putting it.
I mean, the thing is, you have to bear in mind that the problems that we are having now, and that a lot of the adamant Remain, Rejoin camp want to blame on Brexit, are in fact universal problems. Everybody is suffering from hyperinflation. Everybody is facing economic decline and lack of growth. Everybody is encountering the problems that follow on a pandemic in which everybody's economy was put into an induced coma for 2 years. I mean, and in the United States, inflation is wildly out of control, and they have a much more serious unemployment problem than we have. So it would be a mistake to think that people are going to start looking at the EU and saying, "Oh, maybe we should have stayed in."
No, but that was my point. Whether they will feel that they would deliver Brexit on a false premise.
I think the people who believed that have believed it all along.
Right.
There were people who were very angry about the slogan.
So
on
you
the
don't
side
think
of the bus.
yes? You don't think any of the Brexiters, the people who voted for Brexit, will feel, well, hang on, we voted for this because we trusted you, Boris, and now we've decided you misled us.
Yeah, I think they've decided they don't trust him, but I don't actually think that's going to impact much on their feelings.
But 18% of the British public thinks Brexit has delivered. 18%, while 52% voted for it. And it hasn't delivered economically.
But nobody's having a good time economically. I mean,
and you are having particularly
there's going to be,
according to the G7, the worst growth and the worst inflation.
But partly because we came out of the pandemic, the lockdown sooner. I mean, we had our little rise before, and now it's dropping again. Europe is coming out of lockdown more slowly, came out later, and so their catastrophe is delayed.
Right.
I mean, in the next year, I'd put money on this if I was a betting person. The euro is going to have a crisis. And it's not going to be, we may have a crisis as well, but ours is not going to be worse than Europe.
Well, but Janet, you forget that talking about Brexit, we don't want to go into the ins and outs of the decision itself, but Europe has been looking at Britain as a country so deeply divided by a mistake, so the Europeans think, that they inflicted upon themselves. I look at the British history that all foreign dangers that were a peril for Britain saw the society unite behind their leaders. And now you have an issue like Brexit, which is self-inflicted, which you introduce into the political debate, and you're unable to unite the country behind this unifying idea.
It wasn't introduced against the will of the people. You can't introduce a national controversy.
52% is not the people, Janet.
Well, it's enough to win an election.
But not enough to...
You can win a general election less than 50%.
I'll say. I mean, any political leader who got 50% of the vote in a general election would think he died and gone to heaven.
That's all right for personal decisions in elections, but for an issue to master the future of the British political culture.
Well, what would you have wanted? What would you have wanted? A majority of 60%? What would you demand?
No, I don't. It's not what I demand. It's just what I see before me. That the country is still divided, and Brexit is not negotiated to the end. We still have the Northern Ireland Protocol.
And now that's an interesting question, isn't it? If we move on to talk about take it back to the domestic scene, the consequences of Boris Johnson going. We don't know how soon he'll actually leave office, but he's going in the next couple of months probably. What are the consequences for his successor of not so much the way he went, but more the fact that they're following Boris Johnson, do you think, Janet Daly, in terms of within whoever the next Conservative leader is?
Yes, I see. If it's, I mean, my personal preference would be for somebody who would be the antithesis of Boris Johnson would be the anti-Boris Johnson. No, Ben Wallace, who would be. I mean, the real criticism of Boris is he was unserious, and Ben Wallace is profoundly serious.
He's the Defence Secretary.
He's the Defence Secretary who has been conducting an absolutely brilliant campaign over the Ukraine, and he would be so different and such a profound contrast that I think that the memory of Boris would vanish quite quickly.
Right.
What you need is, in fact, the same thing that happened when Thatcher went and was replaced by John Major, who made the vote and ratified the Maastricht Treaty. And that's what you want. And I think Ben Wallace might be the sort of person to...
bring the arguments with Europe to an end.
John Major.
Nobody's talking about reversing Brexit, but actually finalising the...
But he lost the election at the end.
The country is not arguing about Brexit anymore. The country is not arguing. We are, I mean, and people like us, we're still arguing about it. But it's really gone. It's done. It's
But it's still the elephant in the room. Northern Ireland has yet to see peace, have yet to see a return to the regional government and so forth.
Yeah,
you can't just stuff that under the table.
But I'm sorry to say this, but Northern Ireland isn't hugely at the top of priorities for most people in this country.
It's part of the United Kingdom.
It has been a problem for various tragic reasons for a very long time.
What about the identity of the Conservative Party? Is the public clear about what the Conservative Party stands for after 3.5 years of Boris Johnson?
No. I mean that has been one of the more serious problems, quite apart from Boris's personality problems. That has been a very serious problem, and partly again because of these bizarre circumstances. You know, the COVID epidemic and the lockdown and the putting of the economy into a coma. I mean, the question, the Rishi Sunak argument, which is, you must not get into so much debt that you can never pay it off, and therefore you mustn't cut taxes, as against the alternative argument espoused by a good many people, which
Not
is,
least the new Chancellor Executive, Nadeem Zahawi.
which is that you should cut taxes because there's a cost of living crisis. People are going to be either starving or dying of the cold because their energy costs are going so high, and that has to be addressed. And in fact, if you address that, there is an argument that if you reduce the levels of taxation, you get more revenue. The Laffer curve argument. So there is a real argument going on about fiscal policy.
That's why the question of where does the Conservative Party stand is probably not to be answered, cannot be answered.
Well, it can
because
be, but it depends on who becomes leader.
But they're fighting the consequences of a worldwide crisis in trade and
but at the
and
same
society.
time, the official government has said that the budget deficit is unsustainable because it's over 100% of GDP at the moment, the debt. And so the next Prime Minister should in fact diminish public spending and increase tax.
But that's what Rishi Sunak thinks.
But which Prime Minister will do that a year and a half from an election?
I mean, that is very difficult, but it's not unique. This is happening in a great many Western democracies, having precisely this argument, because the same circumstances apply. And with the war in Ukraine and the cost of actual food going up, you know, the imports of wheat and so on, and the cost of energy going up because of what Russia is doing, we're all faced with this problem.
Try and find a coherent philosophy in the face of all those problems that you rightly outline. It's very hard. We're in a fighting mode at the moment, trying to cope with so many, absolutely overwhelming issues that parties, the old catch-all parties, Germany are the same. The support for the usual catch-all parties has now shrunk to 22, 23%.
And
they've been smashed.
Macron is the best
example. He's got
for 5 years, France is completely paralyzed.
Yes, absolutely paralyzed. They're in a worse political predicament than Britain.
I began this programme with a disrespectful remark about the colour of your hair, which I think is beautiful, all of you, by the way. And you've all got more than I have, even now. But on a serious moment, Janet, you came here from the United States when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. Thomas first came to the UK to live originally when Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister.
And me, the young one.
Came when Margaret Thatcher was in her prime. How do you all think Boris Johnson will rate? Maybe not immediately, but in time, in that panoply of big political figures.
I'm sure he had probably thought that he might be another Benjamin Disraeli, a sort of public intellectual, a writer and so forth, and a politician to boot, who has to be taken seriously. It hasn't quite worked out.
Because Disraeli originally was regarded as a joke, wasn't he?
It was originally,
when he first
and people then grew to like him and respect his talents. And now, therefore, he falls out of the template of politicians to be measured. He was and he continues to remain an outsider, an eccentric, an intellectual of great powers and ability. And I think people will try not to rate him as a politician, but just as a colourful person who enriched...
Who just happened to become Prime Minister.
Who enriched the political debate while he was there, and helped us understand that it's not quite that easy to be a politician when you lack certain other talents. Now, he had other talents, which were so huge.
Great communicator.
But he forgot entirely about the political sort of rule book.
Janet.
I think that he will be rehabilitated as a personality, as Thomas says, but he must get out of the way quickly. I wish he had gone on the day that he made that statement. It is unacceptable, as I said at the beginning, for somebody who is his party has decided that he was dishonourable.
And so overwhelmingly.
Yes, it's unacceptable for him to carry on. And he should have allowed Dominic Raab, who would have been the caretaker, to take over.
The worst Prime Minister ever, I think, because he's a serial liar. And for me, British politics has always been that people are moral. You know, of course, Blair did lie also with Iraq, and he's having the cross to bear.
Anthony Eden lied about...
And Anthony, well, he didn't stay long after. But in the case of Johnson, he should have never been Prime Minister. He didn't have any of the qualities of seriousness, partnership, gravitas that you need in a prime minister or French president. And unfortunately, it's a wasted opportunity. So let's hope the next one is in different mould.
Mark Roche, Janet Daly, Thomas Killingham, thank you all very much. One name we haven't mentioned, you might want to go back and look at in the history books, is one David Lloyd George, a great and successful wartime Prime Minister who split his party and continued to undermine it by leading his own faction. Boris Johnson might want to reflect on that. That's it from Dateline London for this week. We're back same time next week. Goodbye.